Amen. Hello, hello. I hope everyone is able to hear me. Um, okay, we can go ahead and get started. Well, on behalf of Politics for Her and Migration Youth and Children platform, I'm so excited to welcome you all to our webinar on intersectionalities, gender, climate, and migration, where we are, of course, focusing on amplifying these unheard voices. So my name is Deja. I will be your moderator today, and I have the pleasure of being a part of both of the organizations that partnered to launch this webinar. And as a quick overview of those organizations, starting with Politics for Her, we are a global youth-led intersectional feminist organization that focuses on emphasizing women, girls, and gender minorities in politics, and of course, emphasizing that representation of women and girls in politics. And then for Migration Youth and Children Platform, or MYCP, we are a self-organized space for children and youth to contribute and engage in high-level migration advocacy. So again, we extend our warmest welcome to all of you who have joined us today, and we are so excited for you guys to be here. So just as a quick overview of how this webinar will go, today we will address the intersections of gender, climate, and migration, and the ways all of these issues are intertwined and how they impact people. And as climate change progresses and both human and natural driven disasters increase, it is crucial to look at how all of this will change the world and paying close attention to those vulnerable populations. We have some speakers today that will dive into this topic in much more detail than I just did. So we are so excited to have all of them speak. The panels will be divided into two. So with the first one lasting 1 hour, where we will have 3 speakers, and then we will have a 5-minute break after the first panel, and then we will dive into the second one that will last an hour as well. So throughout all of their presentations, we invite you to write in the chat any questions that you may have. At the end of each speaker's presentation that will last no more than 15 minutes, we will have a brief Q&A for that speaker. And if time permits, we would love to get to all those questions. But of course, if not, then I will just choose certain questions that people have submitted and ask those, of course, if the speaker didn't already address them in their presentation as well. But at the end of the webinar, after both panels, if time permits, then we will just have like an open Q&A too. So if I didn't get to your question, I will do my best to get to it at the end. But I hope all of this is clear. I don't want to take up too much time because I know we're all here to hear these speakers. So we can go ahead and dive in with our first panel. We have the wonderful Manal, Zainab, and Vania. So we are so excited to hear you guys speak. So Manal, you have the floor. Please introduce yourself, tell us who you are in your own voice, and give us all of your beautiful insights. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Deja. Manal is not here yet. Maybe she's having some problem. We can go ahead with Lebesi, please.
Still with the first panel or with the second one?
No, the first one.
Okay, so Zainab, if you want to go. If you are here, I can't see.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Zainab Yunusa, and I'm a feminist activist and also a development practitioner and gender equality advocate. I work around the intersection of climate change, SRHR, that's sexual reproductive health and rights, and meaningful youth engagement. So it encompasses what we're also here to discuss around climate justice. And I'm currently working with the UNFPA East and Southern African Office, and I'm just supporting the regional efforts in trying to generate evidence on gender and SRHR for to be able to influence advocacy and policy engagement, and also just improving the awareness of this mega trends that we have, of which climate change is one of it, and how that impacts gender equality, and that we're able to incorporate gender transformative climate action in whatever we do. So I hope that is a good introduction.
Zainab, if you want to go ahead with your presentation also, feel free to do so.
Sorry, I was hoping a question would be addressed to me.
Okay, yeah, we can go ahead and go into some questions. So maybe for you, what impact does gender have on migration? And this is both voluntary and involuntary movement.
I think that's quite broad, and maybe what the way I would try to answer that question is to first of all try and talk around what is that intersection per se? What is that connection between gender and climate change? And then perhaps from there we can go into expanding how the issue or topic of migration now comes into the picture. So when we talk about climate change, I want to assume that we all, one way or the other, we have an idea, we have an understanding of what climate change is, perhaps, or even experiencing it. We've seen effects of climate change ranging from extreme heat, ranging from irregular rainfalls to droughts to extreme events, to then having consequences such as migration, forced displacement, involuntary or voluntary, like the moderator has said, on impact on people, impact on the planet, and what have you. And when we have a situation of what would be termed sometimes as the climate crisis, where even both the present and even the future generation are being impacted adversely. But we also know that in as much as everyone is being affected by the consequences of climate change, it is not necessarily equal. People do not necessarily experience it, or communities or even countries don't necessarily experience the consequences, some of these effects and these impacts that I've mentioned equally. We know that in as much as people don't experience it equally, we know that we have evidence has shown that it is usually poorer countries or even marginalized people that contribute the least per se, of which this group of people, we have women and girls, we have gender minorities, we have that are vulnerable to this impact, even though they contribute the least to the climate changing. And so when we begin to look at why is it that these their vulnerabilities are higher, why they are at a higher risk to climate change, you begin to see that there are pre-existing gender inequalities that exist. And what happens is that add that on top of the consequences of climate change, and what happens is that it exacerbates their situation. These are people that are already in spaces where gender inequality prevails, and then you have climate change that is also imposing gendered effects. And what I mean by gendered effects is what I've already mentioned about how the impact of climate change does not necessarily affect people equally. So we have situations where, because of because of the gender identities of people, because of the social relations, the roles and responsibilities that has been ascribed as normal to certain groups of people, whether you identify as a man, a woman, or non-binary, you tend to suffer the consequences, or tend to bear some of the consequences of climate change in ways that are not that is not the same for everybody. So based on your gender per se, you also are at risk, or you face certain impacts of climate change. And that's a sort of the connection between climate and gender, in that because of pre-existing gender inequalities, because of gender identities, people tend to suffer or be more at risk to climate change, and also tend to suffer or face the impacts of climate change disproportionately. It's not the same for everybody. For instance, young girls and women are at risk of child marriage. There is the risk of gender-based violence that we know when cases of climate in areas where there are climate crisis or disasters or emergencies, and where climate shocks happen. And even in livelihoods like agriculture, in countries or places or communities where household food production, or even agricultural labor is more on the female working population, for instance, in South Asia. And then yet women still have tend to have less access to or control and ownership of land compared to their male counterparts in some of these areas. So those are just trying to lay the ground to how gender and climate change intersect and how it is important. And then now bringing in the issue of migration. We know that, like I mentioned, climate change is sort of exacerbating the social inequalities that exist. We know I did mention that whether between or among countries or even people. And then when there is this social inequalities, we now tend to see that there is increasing mobility. People are moving from one place to another, and this is whether voluntary or involuntary. The climate crisis is bringing consequences where we have people that are most times people that are the most vulnerable, people that are impoverished, people that are already in disadvantaged communities. They are the ones that tend to be affected, because also their adaptive capacity. And by adaptive capacity, I mean their ability to adapt to the changes, to be able to still live their life in a way that the impact of climate change does not necessarily affect it or disrupt it. Their ability to do that is quite low. And so you see where they are more affected by the consequences of climate change. And so for some of these people, there tend to be a need to move, a need to move from their place to another place, to some other place. And I mean, research and evidence have shown that internally displaced people record is been on the rise since the post Second World War. That between 2008 to 2020, the numbers of asylum seekers actually rose by about 280,000 persons per year. So we have situations where climate change, we're seeing it playing direct and indirect role in the consequential displacement of people. People are being forced to leave their places, their source of livelihood, their culture, their heritage, some of these places. And we know that there is also a sort of linkage between climate change, displacement of people, climate-induced displacement of people, and also conflict, situations of conflict where there tend to be clashes. For instance, I'm Nigerian, and we know that around the Lake Chad area, the Chad Basin, because of scarcity of resources, which in this case is water resources, there have been clashes, conflict between farmers and herders over grazing fields in northern part of Nigeria. And we know that even in countries like Cameroon, because of water resources that is still dwindling, there's been conflict between fisher persons and farmers. So some of this conflict that is arising, that is climate induced, also sort of interlinks with the movement and migration of people. And we know that there are certain research, there are studies that have shown, that have predicted, there are projections that by 2100, which is 21,000, for lack of a way to better put it, there are the number of people that are living in locations that are likely to be uninhabitable by that year, there are over 800 million, whether it's going to be uninhabitable because of extreme heat, or whether it's going to be flooding and sea level rise. So there are over 800 million that are living in locations right now, whereby in the year 21,000, it is going to be inhabitable. And so when you have situations like this, people tend to want to move. There is the potential to drive mass displacement, migration of people, whether from the coastal area, when you're having projections of sea level rise, meaning that the water will tend to cross the sea water banks, there will be need for people to migrate, to resettle. And then whether within the country, whether within country movement, or maybe outside of the country, international migration or seeking asylum. So it means there is, and then when we have projections like this, then we're having figures where their reports are showing, for instance, there was a World Bank assessment showing that about more than 219 million people could be have a need to migrate within their own countries as a result of climate change impact if no concrete climate change development action is being taken. And so when we then have this kind of situation, how then is this nexus of migration, gender, and climate change? I have mentioned earlier about how people are being disproportionately affected because of their gender, in this case, women and girls and gender minorities. Then we have that it is already happening. There is reports are showing, I think as of 2009, there was a report that was showing that out of 26 million people that have been displaced by climate change, 20 million are actually women. So that's a huge figure to show that when I say it is being, women are being disproportionately affected, 20 million of 26, that's a huge number. And then most of this is forced migration, in that it's not a choice. People are not willingly moving, but they necessarily don't have a choice. And one thing that kept on, one factor or one consequence that kept on popping up amongst these people that are forced that tend to move is there's the heightened risk of sexual abuse and exploitation. So we've seen cases where even when climate-induced migration occur and people are being settled in become internally displaced persons, whether settled in camp, with their research that showed that women and girls are at risk of gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, whether transactional sex, whether abuse, but even by law enforcement people that are meant to uphold the law. So it then brings us to issues of saying, how then do we talk about climate action or solutions to some of these impacts and effects, and making sure that it is done in a way that is gender responsive and gender transformative? And when I say gender responsive, I mean it is done in a way that addresses the specific and unique needs of women, men, boys, girls, gender minorities, each person's their specific needs at whether has to do with their race, their sexual identity, their class, their countries, their communities. We make sure that the solution is inclusive and that we're leaving nobody behind. And I don't know how familiar we are with the International Conference on Population and Development, the ICPD, the program of action, which centers the focus on human dignity and well-being. Because when you factor human dignity, when you take a human-centered, human-based approach, you begin to see the essentiality of protecting the rights of people, whether refugees, whether migrants, those that are affected by climate change, of upholding the principle of the respect and protection, making sure that people can fulfill their human rights, whether they're migrants or refugees. And then you then begin to also see the need to incorporate a gender perspective into these solutions, because you can't necessarily have climate action that excludes this group of people. You can't have climate decision making, people making decisions around climate change without involving women and girls or migrants or refugees or young people that are being displaced, that are being affected by consequences of climate change that they did not necessarily contribute to. So what's the issue of justice in this? You can't necessarily have climate solutions or climate action or without also considering the some of these indirect or long-term impacts. For instance, when you're talking about displacement, now we have a situation where when young girls, for instance, are being displaced from their place, like I mentioned, the risk of an exposure to gender-based violence. But there's also the case where for some of those people, that is the end to their education. So that means that's the end to their education. And with that, there has been linkages between climate change impact and also child marriage, which I've mentioned. So child early forced marriage and unions tend to be on the rise. You have a situation where families are then they negotiating, they're weighing their options between having an extra mouth to feed or giving out the girl child as a bride for exchange for bride price in quote, or bride wealth. We have some of those instances, and then you just generally begin to think of this impact of this nexus. And I think for me, in terms of a response to such, is then that first of all, we're able to amplify this nexus, which is part of what we're doing here on this call. We're able to put it out there in ways that people can easily relate to, that there are interlinkages between these three important issues: climate change, migration, gender. It has impact in certain way. Being able to sort of amplify those interlinkages and nexus, so that you begin to get the attention of some of these people that are in positions to make decisions, or even in the international climate change space, global policy making spheres, or whether it's the gender equality legal or policy institutional frameworks. For instance, there is the climate change meeting going on in Bonn currently, where it's called the subsidiary bodies, where the technical discussions that will then lead to negotiations in the Conference of Parties, which is the COP that happens later in the year. So it's happening now in Bonn. So whatever decisions, whatever agreements, whatever discussions is going on now would feed into the actual negotiations or decisions that would happen in COP. So we need to be able to amplify this impact in a way that whatever decisions is, whatever conversations is going on in Bonn, it will highlight and amplify these nexuses, whether you're talking about in terms of adaptation or mitigation or loss and damages, or even climate finance, means of implementation, in making sure to highlight these impacts, and then call to actions in policy, in the programming. Okay, yeah. And the policy, the programming to call to action, to say solutions that are gender transformative. And by gender transformative, I mean solutions that don't only stop at being gender responsive. They don't only make sure that the unique needs of men, women, girls, gender minorities are attended or addressed, but also go a deep further to be gender transformative, in the sense that the root causes of those pre-existing gender inequalities that make certain group of people at more risk and suffer the impact of climate change. So trying to delve into those root causes of inequalities, which at the very core lies in unequal power, gender power, social relations, trying to redistribute resources, access, control, trying to make sure that women and girls and gender minorities are in positions of power and decision-making, trying to make sure that changing norms, behaviors and norms. So yeah. Let me
those
just
are
leave
all
it.
great points and interventions. Thank you so much, Zainab. So sorry if you could hear that. To move on, just for sake of time, we will go ahead and jump to the next presenter, but thank you so much for that introduction as far as how the panel will go. So next we have Vania. If you could go ahead and take the floor, introduce yourself. Just as a reminder for speakers, you have no more than 15 minutes to present, just for the sake of having everybody have a space to speak. So Vania, please, you have the floor, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Iya. So hi, everyone. My name is Vania Llerena, and I am from Peru. So yeah, basically right now I am part of MYCP. And yeah, for the ones who don't know, it's the Migration Youth and Children Platform, who is also like part of different activities within youth, etc. So yeah, first of all, I wanted to present a PPT. I sent it over the email, Dija. So in this PPT, I'm presenting, I don't know if you can go over it. Thank you. So yeah, in this PPT, I am talking about mainly a little bit of a mix of not only my experience, but the experience of a lot of people, especially in Peru's rural areas. So next slide, please. So just as a like major statistics, guys. So Peru is located in South America, and Lima is the capital of Peru. The total population of Peru, as you can see, is over 33,000 billion. And you can see like Lima population is almost like much more the population in Peru. And actually, like the fact is that in Lima, the majority of people live there, if not actually right now at this precise moment, migrating to Lima due to opportunities, lack of different stuff, climate change, which I'm going to talk about, especially in this, and the migration that it works, that as the previous speaker that's been talking about, the internal migration is heavily happening right now throughout the world, not only in South America, Asia, Africa, etc., but throughout the world. So we have the statistics, and the indigenous population in Peru, as you can see, is almost little. And in fact, the indigenous population have been passing hardships and so on, making them deny their own, let's say, identity at some point, and making them also be secluded until a lot of them have actually been disappearing because of that, and losing over more than 200 languages, according to official statistics of the Peruvian government. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is my like hometown when I grew up, basically. As you can see, is kind of greenery with rivers, animals. You can see little llamas, but actually there are more animals. You just can see a little bit of this picture. And actually, I made a report out of this, so you can just scan the QR code if you want to like watch it out later on. But yeah, so this is Huancavelica, as I told you, it's located in Lima, as you can see on the map. That's the capital. But yeah, a lot of people just think that the capital is mainly like the city. And well, it is true, Lima also has some part of the highland. In other words, highland area and these mountains and all of this, which is unexplored still by the majority of people, even Peruvians themselves. So this is a pretty secluded area still somehow. So we see all this greenery, and as you can see, you may say, oh yeah, but the climate seems great. It seems good. Like I would like to visit, or I would like to see it at least once. And similar scenarios pass throughout the Andes. But what happened? Due to climate change, they have been decreasing. And this is something that I've been tackling in my study. But like, regardless of that, this has been decreasing. At some point, it became uninhabitable. So you can imagine the animals were dying. Not only the animals, the people themselves couldn't restore themselves because they all rely on the river's water, as you can see that river. So all rely on the river's water, and it has been heavily contaminated, not only because of out of necessity of down people, because remember, this is a rural scenario in which people drink even from this kind of water. Some others even like wash their clothes, and remember the contaminants that it comes from that. Wash their clothes, the animals drink from that water, also the crops of the people, they like outsource it from that water. And even big companies had come to these kind of areas, not only like my hometown, which is Huancavelica, but also through other similar areas in which it has been happening. Is like, yes, we see this opportunity, like it's an empty area, secluded area, as I mentioned, there is no much control, so big companies have come to settle in. And the contaminants, especially like from the mining industry, let's say, you know how heavily contaminated this river may be by now. But yeah, this has been taken some years back, and we can go to over the next slide. So this is me when I was in my childhood. As you can see, I was wearing my typical clothes, kind of different right now. But like what I'm saying is like, so yeah. And this is me actually on a donkey, as you can see. And that's the way that I used to go to school. I had to ride a donkey, a llama, or any other animal possible to take me to school over 3 hours. But other kids had it 5 or even 8 hours. So you can say like they were going to school, and some of them used to sleep even on the benches there. But that's another story. But you can see the lack of opportunities that it passed through different kids. And as education, I always say like, even though this is not specifically of education, this panel, I always say like climate change is intertwined with everything, especially with education, because we have the climate change that if it's happening, people migrate to other places that have the opportunity to have this opportunity, like for example a clean air opportunities, because most communities thrive, if you have noticed, and nothing of the statistics, it's my own thinking, but if you have noticed throughout different places in different countries that I have been to, at least you see that the most thriving environments are the environments that have climate in a, let's say, Georgia's way, in a Georgia's manner. And I don't mean that they look amazing. What I mean is like they have it and they preserve it in a sustainable manner. And that's amazing. And there's the reason why, for example, the UNF Triple C has been doing the COPs recently and so on, because it's a global, let's say, necessity throughout the world, despite of our religions, our cultures, nationalities, etc. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. So you can see, these are also indigenous kids. I'm also come from an indigenous background. And as you can see, this indigenous kid also lack of opportunities. Mainly all of them migrate eventually like me. eventually migrate because of opportunities. They migrate also, and thank you so much, Elvina. They also migrate for opportunities, for climate opportunities as well, because as I told you, that some places become uninhabitable, so you cannot live anymore. So you have to migrate. It's not a decision that it's up to you. You have to, for the sake of your health and your life, if you want to survive. Also, a lot of these kids not only go and just take care of themselves, but a lot of them, I am an only daughter, so I didn't pass through that, but like a lot of kids, especially in these areas, have a lot of siblings. So they have to take care of their siblings because their parents are either working, are on the crops, or are even themselves sick. And because of this seclusion, there is no much opportunities, not even, let's say, on healthcare education, but also in opportunities of work. So even sometimes the parents have to migrate alone and leave the children alone because they fear that something may happen to them. They don't have the economic means, etc. Due to different reasons, the kids are stuck there by themselves. And they have to take care of the little siblings. Actually, that little girl, as you see with the little boy on the back, um, she is taking care of the little boy. I know this from another stuff, but yeah. So this girl is taking care of this little boy, and that's having happening throughout. So kids raising kids, and you can imagine how these communities have been passing through different hardships, and how these different hardships have been prolonging generation over generation, because it's a, let's say, a cycle that repeats over itself. And we can go over the next slide, please. So for example, here you can see an image of the same part of Peru in the glacier. So as you can see and compare over the years, this has been decreasing. And not only decreasing, but also you may say, okay, but this is far away from me. It doesn't affect me. Okay, but what happens? This usually, at least on Peru, I don't know how it happens in different areas, but in this area specifically, what happens is that the ice melts. So obviously water. What happens? The water sometimes, not sometimes, but a lot of times, what happens is like the water melts and the water goes down until where people is living. So these people is living there. Imagine the water falls, and because it's an altitude area, it comes with mud, it was with different land garbage or different stuff. It eventually impacts the community, living there with diseases, living then also with that destruction of their own houses, their crops, which is their main source of income, and different ways of stuff. So this is actually happening, and this is not the only word like, oh, it's affecting people. No, but it's actually affecting the climate itself, because the glaciers are there for a reason. They happen to be like, also they liberate different toxins as well, and this has been corroborated by like scientists and etc. So like we can see how damaging the environment it is, and it's not only human made, because back in time, at least in 2001, at least the technology wasn't as much developed as of now. So we cannot blame it that much on like what has been happening now, but also what has been happening before, because that before also have been affecting somehow. But what was the reason? And a lot of time we do not notice these changes until it's actually affecting us. Like for example, if a ranch of flood comes to your house, it's actually affecting you, so you care about it. And this is psychologically proven. Like people in general, they care about something until they mostly affect them, or they get affected somehow, either if it's you or someone related to you, a loved one, etc. Because if you notice, your most passion, and this is something that it's also a study, your most passion come from something that has been heavily impacting your life. Either it's climate change, education, you care for human rights, it has impacted you some way. That's the reason why most people, at least according to that study, care so much about that. But yeah, we can go over the next slide. So it's actually a study that has been done also by INAI, which is in translation is basically like the Institute of Informatics of Peru, and it has been talking about that internal migration and how it has been like promoting somehow in some way internal migration due to work and due to study opportunities, according to census happened there. Different stuff have been happening also throughout all Peru, as I told you, mainly to the capital. My family and I were one of them. We all migrated to the capital because of opportunities, and especially climate, because this became uninhabitable. There were no opportunities. And even if you want to take care of your land, which I think most people who migrate, or even people who care about the climate, want to do, you cannot do so safely in a way that it has been uninhabitable with heavy contaminants and even risking your own life. So this has been a dilemma eventually with the resilience of people, especially with different indigenous communities throughout, especially the Andes, has been restored. Actually, my land is habitable again. There are people going back again, and there's even tourism at this moment. So we can see that this have been happening in different places, but also it has to come from the people with the support of different stakeholders, as well as their willingness to cooperate towards a more sustainable environment, not only for short term right now, but also long term, think ahead of it. How can we cooperate towards making it a safe place for everyone? And everyone is not like, oh yes, I live here for me. No, but like for everyone, even visitors, even tourists, or whoever who wants to visit. That's a beautiful opportunity to restore the planet as well. This can be even like, populated all over again, with different efforts that have been happening throughout not only my community, but we have been doing the same plan through different communities. And actually, I'm gonna be working specifically in empowering Huancahuasi, not only because it's the plan that I come from, but I think that it could be a really nice way of making, let's say, an example throughout at least Peru in order to replicate it to other cities. And I am pretty thankful also to have the support of National Geographic Society and the Nature Conservancy towards this project. Thank you so much. And we have this, and next slide, please. So yeah, as I told you, this is me a year ago, actually. So I went back, and as you can see, this is rural. In the back of the photo, I don't know if you can see like a little box. That's an actual house. And houses like that are pretty secluded, as I told you. Like you can find them even 1 kilometer away, house per house. And imagine now the high schools, if you want to get educated. And right now, it's not only affecting us, but the girls, especially women, in this kind of areas, they have to go and take the water for their crops, animals, washing, whatever. They have to take the water out of uphills, mostly in those areas. It's uphills in the mountains. So what happens? Little girls out of the age of 3, even 2 I have seen. But yeah, from 3, little by little, because they cannot carry a lot. So little by little, they have to carry the water. And imagine going up to a mountain as a 3-year-old kid, let's say, alone by yourself, not with your parents, you alone, and take into consideration there may be animals. So, and the risk that it involves for a 3-year-old kid, even like walking alone in a flat place. Now imagine up a hill mountain. So yeah, going like that, women have been heavily impacted, even more than men in those areas. And we have seen also that these little girls have to even suffer a lot of discrimination. They have seen a lot of lack of opportunities. And even on top of that, a lot of them have been dying out of this. So this is not of the sake of, oh yeah, this is nice. They are super warriors or something. No, but actually kids are not supposed to be doing that. And actual kids have been dying. And as of now, I promise you, and I'm sure, because as long as I know my community, these same kids have been struggling at this point, and I wouldn't be surprised if a kid is dying at this right moment just trying to collect some water. We can go over the next slide. So yeah, that was all my presentation, but as a general reminder, let's care for the planet, and not only the planet, but also for the women there, for the people there, for the vulnerable people there who haven't been the opportunity to talk to, and especially throughout the world, I think, to care for the planet. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I feel like I learned a lot. That was a beautiful presentation. The QR codes were such a nice touch. I hope everybody had a chance to scan them because there's some amazing information in those as well. I don't see any questions in the chat. And so for the sake of time, again, we can go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Fablezi, if you are ready, you can have the floor. Again, 15 minutes if possible, no more than 15 minutes. And I see your camera's on, yay, so we can see your beautiful face. All right, you have the floor, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, I'm Fablezi. I'm also, as my 2 previous colleagues, part of MYCP, the Migration, Youth and Children platform, as well as work in Brussels within a European politics organization, so to keep it short. But as for today, I think I would like to, well, not I think, I am going to discuss the disproportionate effect of migration and climate change with women and children. And so obviously we know that climate change is more than an environmental issue, it is a social justice issue. It impacts, as was previously mentioned, the most vulnerable and the ones who are least likely to contribute to its causes. So as again mentioned exactly in the previous presentation. This is Indigenous peoples, youth, and marginalized communities. So these communities find themselves affected by numerous drivers when it comes to migration, such as conflict and land grabbing. But when we add the pressures of slow onset and extreme weather events, these communities face life-altering decisions that leads them to migrate for safety and survival. As mentioned, I want today to highlight two critical aspects of this crisis: the disproportionate effect on women and girls, and the need for robust policy and legal frameworks to protect their rights and well-being. As the planet warms and climate events become more frequent and intense, the number of people displaced by climate change is projected to rise significantly. Estimates suggest that by 2050, climate change could displace anywhere between 25 million to 1 billion people. I'm sure we've all heard these facts somewhere along the lines of our studies or just in general reads, general knowledge, so to say. The International Governmental Panel on Climate Change highlighted this in their first assessment report in 1990, stating that the gravest effects of climate change may be the gravest effects of climate change may be those on human migration. So climate change in itself does not directly cause human migration, but it does worsen the existing vulnerabilities, making it increasingly difficult for people to survive in their homelands. The impacts of environmental migration can in fact deepen pre-existing gender divides and expose women to new vulnerabilities, as was previously mentioned. And the ones that I would like to highlight today are an increase on the burden of care, higher health and gender-based violence risks, and deepen economic inequalities. It is generally understood that women's options to adapt to climate-related disasters, I'm getting my words so confused. Women's options to adapt to climate-related disasters are strongly influenced by sociocultural gender norms, which often affect or limit their mobility and access to resources. For many women, especially those in developing countries, the decision to migrate is often related to a scarcity of natural resources. Men, being mobile, are often migrating to urban areas in search of employment, leaving behind women to manage households with reduced resources and increased workloads. As these resources become scarce due to environmental changes, women bear an increased burden since their ability to provide for their families is severely compromised. Interestingly enough, this can also affect migration patterns. Studies in Nepal, for example, show that the additional time required for women to collect fodder due to resource scarcity significantly increases the likelihood of their migration. On the other hand, men are more likely to migrate when they face increased time requirements for gathering wood. In regions like Ghana, gender also influences migration strategies. While women prefer temporary migration as an adaptive measure, men tend to opt for more permanent relocation. In Burkina Faso, for example, the volume of longer-term migration, especially for men, tends to decrease during drought years, whereas short-term mobility for women and children tends to increase. So these gender differences in migration patterns highlight the specific challenges women face in adapting to environmental changes. We previously mentioned different aspects of health and gender-based violence today. So this basically highlights how the increased risk of health and gender-based violence risk is in fact, as we know, is usually related to migration, but also is exacerbated when people are migrating due to climate change. So you have, for example, higher rates of malnutrition and maternal health complications due to food and water shortages, which these are just a few examples. Because as we also know, displacement further restricts access to reproductive health services, exacerbating these issues, as well as exposes women to high instances of sexual harassment, assault, and exploitation. Women and girls may often be forced into transactional sex in exchange for food, shelter, or safe passage, exposing them to physical and psychological harm. A significant challenge in addressing the gendered impacts of climate change and migration is the lack of gendered statistics and sex disaggregated data. This gap hinders the development and implementation of gender-responsive policies. The existing policies and legal frameworks that we have don't adequately recognize and protect climate migrants, nor do they efficiently address the specific situations of women and girls. This therefore contributes to the perpetrations of inequalities and vulnerabilities, and arguably even plays a role in continuing the cycle of poverty. To mention just for the sake of expanding our knowledge today for those who don't know, there are a few international frameworks that are related to the gender, climate, and migration nexus. These are the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, the Gender Action Plan of the Enhanced Lima Work Program on Gender, and the Paris Agreement and Glasgow Climate Pact, which explicitly connect the rights of migrants with gender equality and women's empowerment, encouraging parties to ensure gender-responsive implementation of climate action. However, the problem is that despite these international commitments, there remains a legal vacuum, as we call it, to fully protect climate migrants and address the gender dimensions of migration. So how can we effectively address the gendered impacts of climate change and migration? It may sound simple to say, so if we can say the simple solution is by integrating gender considerations into international frameworks and processes. This includes climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies, as outlined in the Paris Agreement, disaster risk reduction as per the Sendai framework, and migration management as discussed in the Global Compact for Migration. Specifically, this can mean, to mention a few solutions, implementing gender-responsive migration laws and policies, strengthening equality and empowerment mechanisms, investing in data and analysis to inform more effective and targeted responses, and developing early warning systems that incorporate the specific needs and vulnerabilities of women and girls. The intersection of gender, climate change, and migration presents a complex and versatile challenge. Women and girls, especially those in developing countries, face unique vulnerabilities that must be addressed through comprehensive and gender-responsive policies and legal frameworks. By understanding and addressing these gender dimensions, we can develop more effective solutions to support those that are most affected by climate change and displacement. In conclusion, addressing the intertwined issues of gender, climate change, and migration requires a concerted effort from all actors of society. As we know, governments, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector must, of course, work together to create inclusive, sustainable solutions. Integrating gender considerations into all aspects of climate and migration policy, we can build a more just and equitable future for all. And when I say we, I really mean all of us, considering that we are actually part of civil society for the most parts. But that's it on my part. Thank you.
Thank you so, excuse me, thank you so much for that. I loved all of the points, especially the ones on the burden on women, especially when men migrate to look for work and how that leaves a lot on the women at home. I think that was an excellent point. So we have some questions. There is some in the chat. I will go with the first one. For sake of time, whoever wants to answer, please limit your response to maybe like 3 minutes, no more than 3 minutes, just so we also have time to move on to our break. But we can go with the first one. This is for all of the panelists. They ask, are there any policies or good practices of countries you know about that aim to tackle climate action while adopting an intersectional approach? So for any of our speakers, do you know of any countries that are ideally doing a good job being intersectional and how they address it? Oh, I think Manal wants to respond. Yes, if you want to unmute yourself, even turn on your camera maybe. But yes, you can respond.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'll be turning on my camera in a bit. It's 2 a.m. where I am right now. And I just have like a small lamp going on here, so I'm just trying to fix my lighting and then turn it on like 5 to 10 minutes. No, but sorry for not joining earlier. Thank you so much for the question. I think that's a very, very important question, which I was going to do in my presentation, but I'll answer it right now. I am a climate activist, and I do follow specifically climate governance and climate negotiations. And if people are familiar with this usually happens at the level of the UNFCCC, which stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is sort of the UN mechanism through which all of the climate change negotiations happen. And within that, there has been and within that, there's a yearly conference that happens every year, which is called COP, which is Conference of Parties. And a few years back, in one of the COPs, I don't remember which COP was it. I think it was the Peru COP, but I don't remember which number of COP was it. Because last year it was COP 28, but this COP I don't remember the number. Within this COP, the parties, all of the parties are part of the UNFCCC, which is like 197 or 198 member parties, agreed to green light a program called the Lima Program on Gender, which means that gender is actually negotiated as part of these climate negotiations. And as part of that, there is a optional, it's not mandatory, but there's an optional policy called the National Gender Action Plan, in which countries commit if they want to, again, because, well, this is the case with all of the United Nations processes. Nothing is mandatory and everything is optional, because unfortunately there's no strong mechanisms of holding countries accountable. And so countries, if they want to, they can, so countries, if they want to, they can implement this. And what it basically says, it's a bunch of recommendations. I'm gonna share the link in the chat. But countries, if they want to, they can implement this national gender action plan, in which they look at the intersection between gender and between climate change, and that includes migration, and that includes health, and that includes various other aspects. And usually what they do is that they have a national action plan, a national gender action plan, a focal point for each country. And this person works at the governmental level with the government and the UNFCCC in terms of implementing gender responsive policies in terms of migration or any other gender intersections with climate change. Very fortunately, there's a lot of countries who are doing this. For instance, Kenya is doing this. Kenya is the main example I know, because they've been doing such a great work. But there's a couple of countries who are implementing this, and I think it's a great way for member states to implement these gender policies and address this intersectionality, at least at the policy level. I'm going to share a link with the list of the countries and the list of sort of the names of these national, oh my God, sorry, my brain is not working anymore. National Gender Action Plan focal points, yep. And there's their contacts and emails, and if people are interested, they can reach out to them. And you can learn more about the work that each person, each focal point, and their team is doing at each of these countries. And I think that's one of the initiatives that is very successful in terms of addressing this intersectionality. Yep.
Thank you so much. And I think great response to the question. Okay. So I see Vanille wants to respond to it as well. And then after this, for the sake of time, we will have our 5-minute break and then come back. I still see that there are other questions that are being posed. So I promise once the next panel starts, we will get to those as well. But just for the sake of time, Vanille, you can answer as well for this, and then we can have our break.
Okay, my name is Vania. Yeah. So one thing also is in the German supply chain, which is basically the German dealing supply chain. It's a law that has been enacted like last year. From January, it has been working, and actually this law has been comprehending a lot of like migration, let's say also climate change and sustainable enterprises especially. So what happens with this law in simple terms, so for all of us to understand, is like, for example, imagine that a big company, let's say, settles in X place with a lot of nature, and obviously because of their practices, they have to throw out the garbage. So eventually they can contaminate a little bit of environment. So what happens here? So yeah, the company has been like contaminating a bit, or has been like, for example, demolishing or destroying, or like creating like, I don't know, that loss of, let's say, trees, to make it simple, the loss of some trees. So yeah, what have been happening with this law? So okay, you can do your practices and as well, but instead of paying us back, eventually, like a lot of government, at least in Peru, like what they do is like you have to pay back to the government what you've been like contaminating or etc. But this doesn't like help to the environment, right? In this law, in the German supply chain, basically it's like, okay, you haven't contaminated, instead of like just cutting trees and giving us money, no, give us the trees back. So these actual companies have to grow up these trees until they are fully grown again and make them available for the environment as well, not necessarily in that area, but in other areas that the government has been deeming like necessary. So this is helping the environment as well. This has been a lot of like a, let's say, contributions towards different stakeholders. Even women have been like taking place a lot within these areas, and men. And we can see also like the contribution that has been happening towards migration in such specific areas that before they didn't have as much population as they have now. And a lot of like the let's say locals in those areas have been stating that the main thing that has been helping them is that climate, and let's say like the sustainability that is happening in those areas, as well as the climate coming back, let's say, towards its nature. So it has been promoting them to settle back again in those areas and preserving them. And actually, this law also doesn't say, okay, just pay us back, but also make your practices more sustainable. So it's not only about like, oh, okay, you like sell and throw. No, but actually it's a circular economic process, which is basically like take care from the production until what you throw it out. But instead of throwing it out, it's like reuse it or some other recycling. And this has been helping towards the environment, and it has been actually pretty successful. And hopefully it's gonna be replicated in other countries. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, and a million apologies for mispronouncing your name. I'm so sorry. Okay, so we can have our 5-minute break right now. It is for me 2:05, so we can come back in 5 minutes at 2:10, or whatever time it is for you at 10. But yes, in 5 minutes we can come back. Thank you all so much, and I hope that this has been great so far. All right, see you guys in 5 minutes. Hello. I hope we're all back. I'll give about a minute just to let people come back. And then we can start with our second panel. Okay, I think we are all here. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope that was a very nice 5-minute break, but we can dive right back in. And also so we can get to some of the questions people posed from the last panel. But without further ado, we can go ahead and get right into the second panel, which we will begin with our lovely Gundo. If you want to have the floor, yes, and your camera's on, wonderful. And just as a reminder, please no more than 15 minutes for your intervention. But you have the floor. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Gundo and I'm a member of the Migration Youth Children Platform. And I live here in Ottawa, Canada. I work with an organization that sponsors refugees between the ages of 18 and 25 to come to university here in Canada. And so my presentation will mostly be about education and how that gets impacted by migration, gender, and climate change. So yeah, like conflict, crisis and displacement in 2022, according to UNHCR, conflict, crisis and displacement caused more than 100 million people to seek resettlement in a third country. And this can cause refugees and displaced children to miss out on many years of education, especially female learners. Years of prolonged conflict and displacement result in considerable variation in access, enrollment, and retention rates of male and female learners because women and girls are more proportionately disadvantaged and pushed out of education spheres as they progress through primary and secondary education. So I'm speaking about a research that I did in Kakuma refugee camp and Kalobey settlement in northwestern Kenya to understand factors that affect female refugees' ability to access, enroll, and retain in secondary school till the completion of secondary school. So in a crisis, a refugee crisis particularly, that leads to displacement of women and girls, and like the whole population as a whole, women and girls face the shocks the hardest. During tough times, their assets are sold first to make up for the loss of income of the male family member. Or in times of food scarcity, they eat after all the male members have eaten, meaning that they are usually left hungry. And it's really hard to go to school and to pay attention in a classroom when you haven't had any food to eat in a day or even 2 days. And so these situations further marginalize women and girls by relegating them to the realm of the household, to chores, and the reproductive burden required to take care of a family. And this further exacerbates intersecting identities that further impoverish women and girls and impede their access to valuable resources such as education. So up until recently, education was considered a fourth pillar of humanitarian intervention. So it was packaged as a service in the same way that shelter, water, and food as provided a service to refugees. And the problem with this is that education requires a long-term commitment. It's not just, oh, we'll provide you food until you're able to find someone your own kind of thing. Like missing out on many years of school requires a lot of catch-up and follow-up classes to ensure that that girls are up to par with their non-conflict affected peers. And most humanitarian interventions see education as a solution, but it's also important to acknowledge that education in and of itself can be a problem for girls because on their way to school they might face sexual and gender-based violence, or even within the classroom, like they might face harassment from their male peers or from their male teachers. So it's really important to look at the benefits of education in an emergency, but also how to support girls that might face challenges regarding the situation that I just mentioned, and how to provide them the support that they would need. So looking at this, what in the context of refugeehood, what keeps girls out of school? So the idea is that girls' roles are socially constructed by others, and this means that they occupy roles ascribed to them and defined by society. As a result, they're not able to exercise their own agency over their educational career, and at times they might have to forego educational opportunities based on parental decisions, expectations, and communities or social pressures. With regards to Kakuma and Kelube, there's a substantial gender gap with regards to boys' enrollment and retention in school compared to their female classmates who navigate uneven access to educational opportunities. This compounded with the situation of drought that northwestern Kenya experiences. Kakuma and Kelube are both in part of like the desert region of that area. And so girls have to walk far distances to fetch water. As a result, this takes time away from their ability to attend classes or to pay attention in school or even to like submit their assignments on time. Recently, the area has been undergoing some flooding, and this results in poor health and sanitation facilities, and diseases spread quickly. Girls do not have access to proper facilities to take care of their menstrual hygiene, and as a result, many of them tend to stay away from school just because the school doesn't have the facilities for them to take care of their health during that time, or the bathrooms don't lock, and that just causes a lot of uncomfortability and uncertainty for girls, which causes them to leave school. And so it's important to study refugee girls as females, as daughters, as students, and as mothers to understand the challenges that they face in each of these identities and how that affects their educational ability. And studying and understanding these intersections is important because it creates each identity creates a different horizontal and vertical inequality. And these inequalities overlap, sustain, and uphold each other to create serious disadvantages for females and limit their ability to access resources and education. And moreover, the structural system that we live in, the cultural and gender norms that operate within our societies and societal understandings of the role of women and girls, and the inherently patriarchal nature of societies that most women and girls live in create barriers that intersect to create hardships for them in their daily lives. And these effects are made even worse and felt more by women and girls in times of crisis, displacement, and resettlement. As a result, all members of society, men, boys, women, girls, other gender minorities, all have a role to play in supporting women and girls during times of conflict, of displacement, of increasing climate uncertainty, to ensure that they're not left out of any spheres and to ensure that they get to enjoy their rights as human beings and as members of society as a whole. And that's me.
Wonderful presentation, Gundo. I love the points on education. I mean, your entire presentation was, of course, on education, but that was such an important thing to address. So if there are any questions for her, please drop them in. But if not, I can go ahead and ask one just to kind of build on it. So, you touched on how better that everybody can help support women and girls in this, but I guess one of my questions would be, what do you think are the current limits in this approach for women and girls? I mean, besides like the obvious patriarchal structures, are there any limits like concretely in place that should be addressed and sort of taken away that can ease this burden on this access to education?
Yes, so with regards to most humanitarian interventions, I would say finances as a major limiting factor. There are a lot of protracted refugee crises now, and most donors don't really know like what to focus their attention on or like how much money, and like with the money that's provided, there's a lot of tagging of, okay, it can only go towards this resource or it can only go towards that. And so that really does affect our response to the needs of women and girls. And also the truth is that most of these interventions that are provided are not gender informed or are not culturally informed and not aware of the social norms and understandings of how that society operates. just because it's not bottom-up solutions, it's top-down solutions made by people that do not live in those societies, in those communities. So I think one thing that we can all do as practitioners in our different fields is to really look at how can we increase the voices of the people that we're trying to help within our solutions, so that when we do provide the solution, it works well. Like in my development studies class, there was this one case study that we had of there was this development company that went into a community and they built a well because they were like, oh, people have to walk far distances, like women and children have to walk far distances to go fetch water. Let's just bring water to them by building a well. But like when they built that well, nobody in the community was using it. And in fact, the people in the community wanted to block it because it was blocking them away from like going far distances to get water. And when asked, why aren't you guys using this well? It's like, well, we're not using it because that far distance that we were walking was a chance for kids to play with each other. It was a chance for us women to unite and like talk about problems that we might be facing. And now that like the well is so close to us, we don't get that chance anymore. So it's like, it's really important to ask the people that we want to help, what do you need? What kind of help do you need? How can I help? Rather than assuming that we know what kind of help is best for them. And also, lastly, it's really important to look at how the role we have in development, in helping people. Are we leaving a positive impact, or are we just making them more dependent on us? Instead of always providing resources, how can we look at capacity building within these communities to make sure that they're also able to develop their own resources? Like I know in the case of Kenya, sanitary pads are given to the women and girls, but they don't have food, so they prefer to sell those sanitary pads to have that extra money to buy food, kind of thing. Or sometimes the food that's given to them by the UN Food Organization, the name just escaped me. The World Food Program, sorry, like the food that's given to them is not necessarily the food that they're used to, so they prefer to sell that food. But how about if we gave them a piece of land to be able to grow their own kinds of food, so that they don't have to depend on the World Food Program, or so that the girl is able to make sanitary pads on her own and can even sell them to use that money to do whatever else that she needs, kind of thing, instead of assuming that we know what's best. Like there's a lot of good practice for sure, but how about we start building their capacity so that they can do it for themselves, kind of thing.
No, yeah, amazing insights. That was great. I think especially on like the sustainable access to amazing points. I literally have no words. But okay, awesome. Well, we can move on to our next one. Frida, I see your camera's on and you are ready. So you have the floor. Thank you.
Hi, Deja. Thank you so much. So hello, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you might be watching this from. It's currently 2 a.m. for me, so yeah, I just love acknowledging like the time difference. It just really shows how, we're doing this regardless of, where we're from. But yeah, so thank you all so much for joining today and for your commitment to addressing some of the most pressing issues of our time that I believe. I'm honored to be part of this discussion, and I would also like to thank Politics4Her and MYCP for organizing this whole thing. So firstly, I'll just start off with a brief introduction. So hello, I'm Huida Zen, and I'm a Sudanese Filipino activist, and I'm advocating for women's rights, climate change, and migrant and refugee rights, which is why I was thrilled to be a part of this event today, because I feel like my interests, as well as my personal life experiences, align closely with the topics that we're talking about today. And I also, before I forget, serve as an advocacy advisor for Politics4Her in the Swan region. So yeah, so today I'll be mainly talking about gender-based violence in climate and conflict-affected settings, with a particular focus on the ongoing war in Sudan and the effects that it has on women. So as we go into this topic, I feel like it's really crucial to recognize how the intertwining forces, I guess, of climate change and conflict exacerbate the already existing vulnerabilities that women have and face. making them almost always the target of violence and stripping them of their rights and dignity. So the ongoing war in Sudan is really a solid example of how conflict and environmental stressors can create a really tough, to say the least, environment for women. So, you know, in these conflict-affected settings, women are unreasonably affected by gender-based violence, or GBV for short. So in Sudan, the prevalence of GBV is alarmingly high. So a study by the International Rescue Committee found that over 75% of women and girls in conflict areas in Sudan have experienced some sort of gender-based violence. 75%, like that is huge. So these GBVs are including but not limited to sexual violence, domestic abuse, and forced marriages. So on the other hand, we also have climate change, which further exacerbates these issues. So, you know, since resources become scarce due to, you know, things like droughts and floods, competition for said resources intensifies really, so it really leads to increased conflict and displacement within communities. So women who were, like mentioned earlier, are often responsible, you know, for fetching water and gathering food. They almost always find themselves at greater risk of violence during these tasks. So the displacement that are caused by these, you know, environmental stressors, as well as the conflict, really places women in these situations where they become, let's say, overcrowded in refugee camps, where security is minimal and the threat of GBV is just skyrocketed. So in Sudan, specifically within the Darfur region, the interplay between climate change and conflict is really evident. So yeah, like I said, for an example, women in Darfur face the dual threat of climate change-induced resource shortages and the ongoing conflict, which has resulted in widespread sexual violence, which is almost often used as a tactic of war, even in other countries. So there has been reports that, you know, sexual violence against women in Darfur, as well as other conflict-affected areas, is not just a byproduct of the conflict itself, but is also systematically used and has been used to terrorize and control communities, because, you know, if you can't get to the men, you target their families or whatever. But the thing is, what I really wanted to highlight here while I was talking is that what's being discussed here is not just facts and statistics. So I personally am a living testament of, you know, the issues that I mentioned. So being from Sudan, I personally have constantly witnessed firsthand how Sudan has been brutally impacted by climate change. So even before the war, from droughts to severe floods, you know, the fluctuation made the climate really hard for millions of Sudanese people to live. And that was, you know, before the war included. So, you know, I personally even have family members who have lost their homes due to these factors. You know, my uncle, for example, has lost his generations-old home and source of living due to severe floods. But the worst did become worst when the war erupted in April 2023. So I was forced out of my own home personally and had to migrate to a place called Port Sudan, which is right across the Red Sea. So since millions of others were also displaced, we were crowded into refugee camps with little to no aid. And we had to, you know, fend for ourselves each day and not knowing when our next meal would be. And that's just a terrible situation to be in, honestly. And little did we know that alongside the lack of access to basic needs and the severity of climate, we also had no access to appliances such as cooling and whatnot. There were more issues. So in the area where I was staying specifically, there were several individuals, you know, sneaking into the unsafe area that we were in and they're doing unspeakable things to people who are asleep at night. So this unfortunately did cause so much fear within our space, and we couldn't even call it a safe space anymore. So I would also like to share a story from my friend who shared this with me, but she wanted to remain anonymous. So she was also forcibly placed in a shelter that was, you know, deemed safe, but Just like the rest of us, she also faced common issues such as no access to electricity, water scarcity, and the rare blessing of feminine hygiene products. So it was rough, but she and her family were strong enough to persist, just like how I imagine every single refugee or migrant shows immense strength. So the shelter that she was in was really hard to live in. So some individuals, or I would say the majority of men, would only provide resources under their own conditions, meaning that they would exploit the victims. So many of the women faced aggressions, prejudices, and fewer privilege simply because of their gender. So they were also denied access to food sometimes because men should eat more, and also denied access to menstruation products and feminine hygiene products because they were considered less important than the other resources. So unfortunately, this one night, a random person just attacked my friend's sister, permanently injuring her, and these scars will live with her forever, unfortunately. So the reason why I'm sharing these stories is because sometimes when people read about issues like these from countries where they couldn't dream about being affected, they read these stories and situations, and they comprehend them like they're like a faraway fairy tale. But I'm here to remind you that these are like real people with real dreams and aspirations and lives. You know, when we talk about these issues, we must remember that behind every statistic is a human being who endured unimaginable hardships. And it is really important not to only acknowledge these realities, but, you know, act on them. So provide support and solution. So it is really crucial that we do keep talking about these issues and push solutions that tackle both the immediate problems and, you know, help solve these in the long run. So I know for some people, this is just a webinar that they can just attend to and go on with their lives, but I'm here to remind you that these people are suffering, regardless of whether you're keeping an eye on them or not. And if you can't do your work as an activist and spread awareness on public platforms, there are definitely other ways to help. You can tell your friends and family about the issue. You can donate to charities, volunteer, participate in fundraisers, sign petitions, use your social media. And yeah, that's it on my end. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing all of those insights, and also a very special thank you for sharing your personal stories and the stories of your friends. I think that is an amazing point to have, that these are other human beings that we are talking about. We have to humanize this issue. It's not just an abstract issue of climate change and migration. We are talking about human beings who have the same emotions and dreams that we all have. So amazing points, absolutely amazing. And yes, very sorry for your friend and her sister. And we just hope that everything improves for everyone, and that we will do whatever we can, of course, to also help that. But thank you for that. I don't see any questions, but we will have an overall Q&A at the very end. So we can move on with our final speaker and then just have a grand Q&A if questions come to people towards the end. So last but certainly not least, we have Manal. If you want to take the floor, turn on your camera if you are able to, and share your wonderful insights for the next 15 minutes. Awesome.
Yeah, sure. Can you give me access to share my presentation? Just prepare like a very short slide, some very short slides, brief slides about that.
Yes, you can do it.
Okay, hold on. All right, 1 second. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, also, I also apologize. I think it was very wrong information from my side when I talked about the gender action plan. I assumed that migration was included in it because I attended a couple of workshops and migration was talked about, but apparently within the program itself, migration is not mentioned. And thank you. Sorry, it was Fiblesi. I hope I'm not mispronouncing for clarifying that. I think it's probably more depressing right now for me because I'm majoring in global governance. It's more depressing and frustrating for me to know that there's no current framework in which this intersectionality is like the main theme or the main focus. So yeah, thanks so much for clarifying that. And now back to my presentation. I wanted to talk about the gender dimensions of climate change, which were already tackled by the speakers, but I wanted to sort of give a more nuanced perspective, especially in terms of data and statistics, and also in terms of policy and governance. So I think it's not very fun being the last speaker because at this point everybody has already mentioned the great points and the most important points, but this is just a reminder that climate change does affect everyone, but women specifically are impacted differently because of current gender equality, because of patriarchal society, because of various societal, eco-social, economic and social dimensions of society that just make it harder for women to be resilient to climate change. And in terms of migration, migration and climate change, there is a increasing sort of momentum around the term climate refugees, even though it's not an acknowledged term according to IOM. They're called climate migrants instead of refugees, because to have the refugee status is even a more sort of difficult procedure because it has to go under the Refugees Convention, and it's even more complicated. So in practice, they are climate refugees, but theoretically, they're called climate migrants. And these people are estimated to be around 200 million by 2050, which is like a huge number. And here we're not only talking about sort of extreme weather events like floods or climate disasters, but we're also talking about people migrating from their areas of living because they cannot survive there anymore. Coming from my country, I'm originally from Morocco. I also just realized I didn't introduce myself. Oh my God. My name is Manal. I'm a climate activist. I am from Morocco and I'm currently based in China. I'm doing an exchange program here, which means that it's like 2:40 a.m. But I stayed awake to hear the amazing insights of everyone. And so why did I introduce myself? Yeah, I introduced myself because I'm from Morocco and my country is having right now one of the worst drought seasons ever. And because of the rainfall and the increasing temperatures in some regions, a lot of people are migrating, especially from rural areas to urban areas. And even within the urban areas, a lot of people are contemplating migrating from the south of Morocco to the north of Morocco because it's just not livable anymore. Like for instance, last year we had like a record high temperature, 55 degrees, and it was like 55 degrees Celsius the whole day. And we couldn't survive, and a lot of people could not afford AC, and a lot of people just had to sort of figure out either migrate to other cities or figure out ways to deal with it. And especially in terms of the hierarchy in Morocco, women were unfortunately not able to afford AC. But I know people will be like, no, it's just AC, you can survive without it. But that's also an example sort of how gender inequalities in terms of income can make livelihoods of women even sort of more difficult and harder. And so in terms of vulnerabilities, recent statistics shows that women are 14 times more likely to die. I hope this does not happen. We don't want women to die, but 14 times more likely to die is a huge number. And this comes up to women not being able to migrate when a climate disaster happens, or women not having access to food because they don't have an income or because they're dependent financially on a man. There's a multitude of reasons for which women, when a climate disaster happens or an extreme weather event happens, they're just stranded and not able to survive. Economically, they're also more disadvantaged, especially in terms of employment, in terms of access to resources. This can be financial resources, this can be food, this can be opportunities, this can be also opportunities in terms of policymaking, of representation. And in terms of health, when this is a very interesting example because when an extreme weather event happens, women do not stop being women. So like, for instance, in my country, I come from Agadir, which is a city in the south of Morocco, and in last September there was a major earthquake, the most major earthquake in the history of Morocco, which happened like a few kilometers away from my city. And when that happened, there was a lot of women who were pregnant, but also a lot of women menstruating, and all of the aid that ended up happening, sort of going to that place in which the earthquake happened, just somehow did not have any sanitary pads, did not have any of the medication that pregnant women needs. And everyone was like, there's that, it's not just about men who were, affected by the earthquake. There's a lot of women who were there, and women cannot just stop menstruating because an earthquake happened or because a climate change disaster happened. And so there's that. And another thing as well is in terms of migration patterns, there's this very famous number, about 80% of climate refugees or climate migrants, because when displacement happens, it's mostly women who end up getting displaced the most because of gender inequality, and because when climate change happens, it's also in terms of migration patterns, women also end up losing their livelihoods. Coming from my own context in Africa, I come from Morocco, which is in North Africa. Women do engage a lot in agriculture. We're very famous for, the region I live in is very famous for the plantation of a plant called argan. And if you're a woman, you know that argan oil is one of the best oils in the world. Yeah, it's very good for your skin. A lot of people don't know that behind that oil industry, there's a lot of women. There's a lot of women-led corporations, and these women corporations end up producing most of that. And now, because of the drought that is caused by climate change, a lot of their livelihoods is lost, not only in terms of economic livelihoods, but also in terms of their indigenous and cultural heritage. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and also like in terms of remittances, in terms of risks, there's more increased risks for gender violence, for domestic violence, for exploitation, for trafficking, because when a flood happens, you're just stranded. Like there's no accountability, there's no police. Everyone is so worried just about survival. So if rape happens, I mean, God forbid, or if instances in which women are exploited or abused happen, there's no way to hold the perpetrators accountable for those. And so there's a lot of case studies that were done about this, especially in terms of the Global South, because unfortunately in the Global South, that's where dealing with these gender inequality that happens, that is fueled by climate change, is even more difficult because of lack of resources, because of lack of financial resources mostly, but also because of lack of awareness, because of lack of tools and capacity, also in terms of human resources. And so in Bangladesh, for instance, Syria and Sub-Saharan Africa, there's been a lot of case studies. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but there's a lot of case studies around, and I've put here some resources and references. I'm happy to share this presentation afterwards so you all can have the links. There's a lot of case studies around how women in these areas, because of climate change, and also because of the fact that they are in Global South areas, end up getting more affected. And also just a side note on this, because Syria is mentioned, it's also very important to remember the areas in which there's conflict and in which there's militarization, because that's even worse. So you have climate change and then you also have conflict. And it's even much harder for women, especially right now. We're talking about what's happening right now in Gaza and Palestine, and what's happening right now in Sudan, in Congo, in a lot of these areas in which women are just forgotten from the picture. Yeah, we're talking about human rights, and we're talking about the need for dealing with this militarization conflict going on, but we also should acknowledge that these women have to deal also with climate change at the same time, and its different impacts. And so the more frustrating part of this is that when it comes to policymaking and when it comes to putting all these stories into representation of all these stories and listening to these stories, you don't really have a lot of opportunities to do so, especially in the Global South. This is a map of countries that shows sort of how much representation of women there is in legislative bodies, and usually this is parliaments, at least in the context of my country. You can see here, it's there's only 3 countries in the world in which the representation of women is more than 50%. And that tells you, and my country is like 11 to 20%. And that tells you a lot about how if women are not the ones making decisions, then about this, then how are we supposed to like put an end to this issue? I'm not saying men cannot also contribute to making policies that are gender responsive, but I'm just saying that women are very much excluded from the picture. And what happens is that a lot of these voices and a lot of these stories and a lot of the policies needed to respond to these issues also get lost. In terms of governance, also at the climate change or at the environmental governance or climate governance level, there's also very minimal representation of women in these decision-making processes. These are some statistics about the UNFCCC, specifically the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which women, well, in 2018, they made up to 40% of the delegation, but last year, which is 2023, they only made up like 28%. And so you're asking yourself if women are not, sort of, women do make up like more than half of this planet. And then when you go at the actual decision-making tables, you will realize that the gender that is making decisions on the behalf of everyone, also including that over 50% of the planet, is usually men, and usually not really very invested in addressing this intersectionality between gender and climate change, and also in terms of migration. I just also wanted to speak about like very quick concept of environmental justice, because what happens is that I think we're all aware that in terms of climate change, it happens because of greenhouse emissions, and this is usually because of the fossil fuel industry. But if you look at the historic emissions, and if, well, to phrase it differently, if we look at who is causing climate change or who caused climate change, it's mostly global north countries, right? But then when you look at who is affected by climate change, it's suddenly like the colors are flipped, and it's usually global south. And it's very frustrating because the women who are affected, who need to migrate, have at the end of the day not contributed pretty much anything to the whole crisis, but they have to deal with it, and they have to deal with all of the impacts that come from climate change and that come from them being women in a climate crisis. Yeah, and this is just like within like women, there's even more risk to pregnant women, to women who have infants, to infants themselves. These are a couple of statistics. Sorry, I'm just skipping all of this because we don't have time. There's a couple of statistics about sort of the climate injustices and unfairness, also global north versus global south. There's a movement called the Feminist Climate Justice Movement that is trying to sort of look at these climate change and climate justice from a feminist perspective, in which women should not only be at the center of policy making, but their views and their perspectives should also be taken into account. And so finally, this is my last slide, one of my last slides, around policy recommendations and actions. I personally believe, and there's a huge debate between which is better. Do we do bottom up, or do we do bottom down, or do we do like top down approach or bottom up? What's working better? I personally prefer top down. I believe in policy, and I believe that policy could really help change a lot of the framework that we live in, and help put an end to all of these issues that we all talked about during this event. And that includes first gender inclusive policies in terms of adaptation, migration, and resilience. Also supporting women migrants, also making sure that in terms of policy, they have legal protection, they have healthcare, they have social services when they need to migrate because of climate change or because of anything, frankly. And empowerment and education. There's a lot of women who don't know about this. And if we're investing in educating women who know a lot about these issues and know how to speak out about them, then we will raise a generation of women who are able to put an end to climate change, not just climate change impacts on women, but like climate change in general. These are a couple of very inspiring women who are doing just so. My favorite is Mia Mottley, who is the current Prime Minister of Barbados. Yeah, and this is my last slide. This is a quote, one of my favorite quotes, "Nothing about us without us." This is a picture of the last COP28, which is like the event in which climate policies are made, like the most substantive climate change policies are made. And just like very challenge to all of you. Can you spot how many women are here? Can you spot? No? Can you spot? Like bonus points if you can spot more than 5. This is the status quo. This is what's happening right now. And this is sort of the ideal, hopefully, in climate negotiations, we see more women. And hopefully all of us, like within this group, whether women or men or other genders, were able to put an end to the climate crisis and mitigate its impacts on women. Is this proportionate impact on women? Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Oh, wait, sorry. And these are references here, and these are my contacts. If you want to contact me, please follow me on Instagram. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm done.
So we will, there's some people that are asking for the rest of your presentation. So yeah, if anybody wants to get in contact with her, otherwise we will look to send it out to all attendees that do want that. So we have less than 10 minutes left in this webinar. I was going to address some of the questions that we didn't get to within the first session, but I see that our lovely speakers have been so responsive and have taken the initiative to respond to people in the chat. So that has been absolutely wonderful. I don't know if any want to come off mic and maybe talk briefly about what they responded to. I'm trying to scroll to find some because they were definitely interesting questions. But otherwise, if there are no more, I don't mind posing questions, of course. Because I feel like I always have questions. But a very quick thank you also to all of our speakers. Every single one did a phenomenal job. I think every single one touched on a different sort of lens on the issue of intersectionality and climate and migration and gender. You know, we heard personal stories. We heard of statistics, very specific statistics in different parts of the world. You know, we heard of that sort of disproportionate experience that a lot of different people are going to, a lot of different women and girls are going through. So I think I'm confident that everybody is leaving with a lot of inspiration, but also with a lot of knowledge in how we can move forward. But if nobody else has to submit questions, I don't mind asking maybe like a farewell one. Yes, of course, I know. Thank you. Let's see. I think just in general, I know I asked this towards the beginning, but maybe just for any of the speakers, just the ways that we can better our support for women and girls, especially in their mobility. We heard of all the challenges that are there. So the ways that we can honestly tackle this and make it a bit more feasible and also sustainable for women and girls who are on the move as a result of climate change or as a result of conflict that is exacerbated by climate change, like we heard earlier. But if anybody wants to answer. I see Manal dropped her link for the presentation. So yeah, for anybody that wanted that. Yeah, Manal, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to share something that I'm personally doing is since I believe that the solution is in policy and policy making. And I believe that if policymakers had the will, we wouldn't be talking about this right now. So I would suggest to really invest and get involved in advocacy and mostly lobbying. Within the ICCC, there's a lot of opportunities for us non-state actors to engage. And one of them is there's a lot of various constituencies, which is an unofficial but like also formal mechanism for non-state actors to engage. There's one for young people, there's one for farmers, there's one for indigenous people, and there's one for women and people of other genders, and in which this one is sort of really following up with most of the processes that happen. Within this constituency, there's a lot of opportunities to directly have access to a lot of internal documents and internal negotiations. And so I'll paste the link for that. But then other than that, there's also a lot of opportunities for observers and NGOs who have an observer status and also engage in advocacy efforts. And so I would personally just suggest to engage in that. And then the other thing is, if you're not able to, just I think outreach and communication is very important. Social media can be like a huge thing to share the message and to share more about this. And I would just say post about it, please. And if you're not able to post about it, just tell people you know, or tell people you don't know about it, to make sure that everybody knows about it. I was very surprised by how many people still don't know what climate change is, and still don't know what climate migration is. So maybe we could start also from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think awareness is a really big portion of it, especially in how we can, like to my question, how we can tackle, or not tackle, I'm sorry, but better support women and girls on the move. Yes, go ahead. Sorry, I can't see the chat.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
and also, yeah, thank you so much, Dia. And adding up onto that, something, and I can tell you from personal experience as well, from other experiences I have been like being engaged to, is not only a necessity as of now just to engage within that, but it's just like mostly a must for us, especially youth, especially women, because we have been historically displaced from these places. And actually, just like a little short experience is like, for example, in the Congress of Peru, in which I started, there was no place for people like me, and people like me were discriminated. Even women were not allowed within those places, and so on. And what I did, and I know this may be a little bit controversial, but what I did is basically just be there and, like, honestly, just be there until they got bored of me. Eventually they had to listen to me, and that's how they started to bring all the indigenous people after that. And that's how a lot of people in different places around the world have been empowering not only themselves and their own communities, but also other communities that need such empowerment and need such spaces, not only to talk and being engaged, but also they need those spaces to be heard, amplify their voices, and not only that, but also be taken into account, because a lot of policymakers around the world, they engage with youth, and this is a common practice, at least from my experience, that they engage with youth, they listen to us, but that's it, that's the end. And it shouldn't be like that. It should be like a follow-up. It also should be taking into account our points and also implementing the ones that are good enough. So also all of this has to be taken into a policy, taken into consideration, like the different, let's say, realities throughout the world, the cultural aspects and so on. And who else is better to know that than the own citizens? So I believe like each one of us has the power to not only have those spaces, if not available yet, but also create those spaces for whatever you guys feel wholeheartedly moved to do. Either it's migration, climate change, youth, feminism, or either, right? And like I just believe like here there are so much potential around all of people here, and I thank you so much to Politics4Her for the space, for MYCP for the invitation, and for everyone you all here, because you are giving such a spaces, you are listening to other people, and that's extremely important. And thank you so much to each of you. You are such warriors, and I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yes, I agree. Take up space. You know, you got to make people listen to you. I know we are at the end mark, but Huida, I see that you wanted to say something. So please, you know, very quickly, maybe share your points.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, quickly, I just wanted to say that, yeah, all the solutions that have been mentioned were, of course, you know, important, and we should work on implementing them. But I want people to realize that, you know, many people overlook the fact that these prejudices, especially against women, are deeply embedded in some cultures and history. Like I'm talking, I mean, in my personal experiences in the African and Asian community, it's been deeply embedded. And I truly believe that, you know, to change these perspectives, we should educate the youth, since, you know, they are the future generation. So tackling governments definitely that have years of systemic oppression against women, it is important. But I also feel like changing the mindset of the next generation is even more important. So I feel like social media can be a powerful tool for this, since it has proven to be effective in raising awareness about other issues. But like for those who do not have access to social media, I feel like we can dedicate workers to go to their communities and teach them directly. And I also feel like it would be great to, incorporate lessons on gender equality and all the other topics that we mentioned into school curriculum so that, they would be aware of these issues, from a young age instead of just, like thinking of it as like a far-fetched, government-made, I don't know, propaganda or something.
Awesome. Totally agree. Okay, we are going beyond time. So to be respectful of everybody's time, I will wrap it up here. Valentine, I see your note on how the Geneva Convention does not acknowledge refugees as being under like climate displaced. So there have been discussions on having the term of climate refugee. That is not in practice yet though, but as it was stated earlier, this webinar, these conversations, these discussions that we had today, they do not end here. They will be ongoing. So please continue this in any space you have, in any organization you have. Like it was said earlier, take up that space, use your voice. This was to amplify these unheard voices. So make sure that you are heard. But yes, just to wrap up, again, a million thank yous to all of our amazing speakers. I know some have already departed because it is very late for many, so I will go ahead and really try to wrap this up quickly. But thank you also to our wonderful audience for being a part of this, for being here, listening, sharing your insights, asking your questions. We hope that it was beneficial for you and that you enjoyed yourself. They dropped the contacts for both Politics4Her and MyCP. Oh my gosh. So please follow us to stay up to date on all our future events, and we hope to see you guys again in the future. Everyone have a great rest of your day or rest of your night, wherever you are. Take care and yeah, stay in your advocacy. But thank you all so much. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.